Thank you for the introduction. As Abby said, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to find those acres on your farm to target for some of these improvements. So just as a general statistic to kind of wrap our minds around what we're looking at on an average field across the nation, 20% of your farm is losing money, 20% is breaking even, and 60% of the farm is what's turning your profit. So as much as we would love to put conservation wherever we feel like it, really targeting the acres that aren't making us any money and doing something else with them is really going to be the focus tonight. And if you are working with GPS technology and you have a platform like Climate or John Deere Ops or Granular, you can get a really pretty red-green picture like the one on the screen. But if you don't, there are still a bunch of publicly available mapping options that can help get you started. So for one, there is a maps.datafarming online site that will get you NDVI maps. And these are basically red-green maps that tell you how much production is going on just in terms of leaf and green on the field. So this is a really good indicator for production, for yield. If you don't have your own yield maps, this is a really great way to translate where your highest yields are coming from within a field. So for example, you can see in this map all along the left side of the screen is a lot of red. And that is where our productions are low. So on this field, those are the areas we could target. And a lot of farmers know where your lower yielding acres are, but really getting a visual of it can help for this decision-making process for taking those next steps. Another great place to get maps is web soil surveys. And these will give you soil type maps. So you can see if maybe where your low yielding acres are overlay with maybe a wetland soil. And that again will help make those decisions of what else we can do with that land. And lastly, also on web soil survey is topography mapping. So finding those low laying areas, making sure that the waterways are flowing the way you think they're flowing, to determine ponding and things like that, or dry areas on hills. And the links for these publicly available platforms are all in the chat if you want to go around and play with them. We don't have time to go over every single reason that a field could have low return on investment or ROI. So I'm just going to focus on one that I can guarantee every single person has on their field, and those are field edges. As you can see in this picture, all of the soybeans that are right along this field edge that abuts the trees are doing much more poorly than the soybeans that are further out in the field. And I'm sure this is a common sight for most people. There are quite a few reasons that this happens, mainly due to there being a microclimate. Depending on what is next to the field edge. If it's next to a forest like this, maybe there's shading, maybe there's some issues with water. If it's along a waterway, if it's along a roadway, there could be some issues with salt or wind. Or maybe it's not next to one of these things, but it is a hedgerow, places where you're turning around your equipment on and it's creating compaction. So just for another visual, this farmer was farming edge to edge, pretty much everywhere he could get his tractor, he was farming. And every single place there's a color on this map, this farmer is losing money. where it's a more green dot, it's around $60 an acre they're losing, but in the darkest red colors, they're losing over $500 an acre. So again, being able to look at these kind of maps and, knowing that, oh, those acres aren't really, producing that much, but really seeing the dollar amount that you're losing by just putting on seeds, making those passes, adding fertilizer, and then not getting any yield from it. That's where that loss is coming from. So the first option to deal with this is to just don't farm it. Basically, you're not putting all of those inputs onto these areas that aren't making money for you. So I'm just going to run through a quick, here are just some quick numbers that I threw together as an example. Just by farming the edges, if you're making 158 bushels an acre, over 100 acres, let's say, and again, 20% of that field is losing money. Let's say it's making 0 bushels an acre at $5 a bushel. The net income is going to be negative $10,000. And if you have any questions at the end about where some of these numbers come from, we can definitely do a deeper dive. But using these same numbers, and the only things that I have changed are the variable costs, and then our bushels per acre go up because we're not including those acres that are losing us money. So it's 197 bushels an acre over 80 acres rather than 158 bushels an acre over 100 acres. And so just by taking out those variable costs, not putting seed on those acres, the fertilizer, not, making those tractor passes, takes us from the red into the green. Again, it's not taking us very far into the green, but it's better than being 10,000 in the red. But of course, Mother Nature hates a void, and if you don't plant something there, she will. So in the best interest of not increasing weed pressure on our producing acres by leaving those acres just blank, another option is to plant an alternative crop. Something that's easy, that doesn't require really any inputs, that you could just leave there as a sort of cover crop if you felt like it, or harvest it for either forage or seed. So great options for that are buckwheat or millet. Again, pretty cheap seed, easy to throw down, easy to come up, and sort of do what you want with it from there. Another option is to plant grasses. On the left, we have some cool season grasses along this waterway that serve to really hold that soil in place, and filter out any nutrients that we might be waking it into that waterway. Again, this is a more permanent option for those areas. Again, you can graze those or hay those if you have any livestock, or your neighbors have livestock that can make use of that. Or native warm season grasses like in the right-hand picture. This is also really great wildlife habitat if that's what another focus for you on your farm. And the last option is to plant habitat. So either upland habitat, like in the top picture, which is really heavy on grasses, or pollinator habitat, like in the bottom picture. Again, you can see in these pictures just how lush the crops are, budding up to these borders that we didn't see in that first picture of the soybeans coming up to the forest. So we're really, the issues that come with being along a border are non-existent when we put in this type of buffer. And there are a couple of different ways that you can use these opportunities to not only take your farm out of the red and into the yellow, breaking even, but you can also get paid for, which Abby is going to talk about next.
All right, let me set up my screen here. All right, how's that look? Okay, so as Sarah said, the way to really take advantage of planting or to make money on these acres that you're deciding to not farm potentially is to enroll them in programs. It's the most common way. And the programs generally will require you to establish permanent cover. So the grasses that Sarah was talking about, the upland habitat, the pollinator habitat, is the way to get into the programs and to make these acres go from losing you money or being neutral to actually earning money on those unfarmed acres. So I really just want to dive into what it looks like to actually establish this permanent cover, kind of the steps to take, and just kind of drill down into that so that if this is an option that you think is feasible for your operation, that you kind of understand the workings behind it and what would be expected of you if you do decide to enroll those acres into a program, or even if you decide to do the work yourself. So as Sarah mentioned, there's three kind of major types of permanent land cover that you can select from that would be useful in Ohio. So the first are cool season grasses. So Sarah mentioned these. These are things like orchard grass, fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. So grasses that grow for the most part really densely and are pretty easy to grow. People are familiar with these pasture type or lawn type grasses. These grasses would be appropriate if you have erosion issues at the edge of your field and you're wanting to really hold down the soil. These grasses grow pretty densely, and so they lock up all the available soil and prevent it from leaving the field. As Sarah mentioned, if one of the side benefits you want to try to get from establishing permanent cover is to hay the acres, the cool season grasses are also an option for that. Warm season grasses, so these are things like Indian grass, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, eastern gamma grass, the list goes on. But the big difference between these warm season grasses and the cool season grasses is, for the most part, the warm season grasses grow in clumps. So instead of growing in a carpet and taking up all the available soil, these warm season grasses grow in little clumps across the acres. And that's really great for wildlife that needs to move around at ground level and look for bugs and look for weed seeds and to be able to feed themselves. So if one of the side benefits that you want to see by establishing permanent cover is to attract things like pheasants or quail or other grassland nesting birds, warm season grasses might be a good way to go for you. The last one that I wanted to mention is a favorite of mine. I'm actually a pollinator habitat biologist, so I got to talk to you about pollinator habitat. So for our purposes, though, I don't want to talk so much about attracting the bees and the butterflies. So those critters are very important, but I think something that doesn't get talked enough about with pollinator habitat is that it has the potential to attract pest predators. So things that eat crop pests. So not only do we get the birds that are going to come in and eat caterpillars and pick up weed seeds, but we also attract insect pest predators like wasps and spiders that attack other insects that would otherwise be eating your crops. So if you are looking to kind of add to your pest control and to work in some integrated pest management, pollinator habitat might be something to consider. So to establish these more native types of land cover, so the native warm season grasses and the pollinator habitat, there are a couple things to think about, and really for the cool season grasses as well. So the first thing is, much like when you go in and you plant your crops, the seed bed's going to need to be prepared. And two things that I like to put on people's radar are that soybeans before planting a permanent cover are best. And the reason for this is they don't leave behind a lot of residue, so we get good seed to soil contact for our permanent cover mix. And they don't interfere, soybeans don't interfere with the native warm season grasses like something like wheat might. Think about also what herbicides you're using in the areas that you want to plant to permanent cover. So if you're using an herbicide with a short-term residual, you should be good to go. But if you're using something that's going to stick around in the soil for more than 4 months, you might want to either plan ahead and use only herbicides with a short-term residual in those areas that you plan to plant, or consider putting on a cover crop that will be more tolerant to the herbicide and kind of act as a space saver until that herbicide moves out of the soil. Seeding is pretty much all the different types of land cover can be seeded with a broadcast spreader or some sort of spreader that has an agitator in it. Our native warm season grasses and pollinator habitat cannot be seeded using a conventional seed drill. If you want to drill the seeds, you'll need to track down a native warm season grass drill to accommodate the fluffy grass seed or the really teeny tiny seed that you find in pollinator habitat. So it is a specialized piece of equipment that you need to use if you really want to drill the seed. But pretty much everybody can find a broadcast seeder of some sort that would also be could also be used to plant these permanent covers. Maintenance. So in the first year, regardless of what kind of cover type you're establishing, you want to make sure that the annual weeds don't take over in the first year where that seed mixture is growing. So you'll want to mow it a couple times during the establishment year. And really it's about a once a month mow or even less if for some reason stuff's growing pretty slowly. But after that establishment year, the care for these permanent covers can be pretty minimal, especially for the warm season grasses and the pollinator habitat. It is really best to leave these things alone for the most part. Mowing them every year or several times a year really degrades the quality of those stands. So instead you'll be on more of a management on a 3 to 5 year cycle. So once every 3 to 5 years, looking at doing some sort of management activity. So once the establishment period is a little more intensive, but after you get it established, you can pretty much leave it alone. Okay, so that's my spiel on what it's actually like to establish permanent cover. I don't want to get people stirred up about native warm season grasses or pollinator habitat. They're like, whoo, I didn't know it's going to be, this many steps to get it going. So that bit is over. Let's talk about actually how to turn those unfarmed acres green. So as I mentioned, really the way to do this is to enroll those unfarmed acres into programs that pay producers to not farm those acres. So probably the most common program available is the Conservation Reserve Program. Most people call it CRP. This program has been around since the 80s. It's widely used across the nation. And the focus of the program is to reduce erosion on the farm and in the community, and also to establish wildlife habitat where it's most needed and for species that most need additional habitat. The reason why I think CRP fits with this conversation tonight is that it provides financial incentives to farmers. So the program pays towards the establishment costs of putting in permanent cover. So, you can establish permanent cover on your own if you're worried about that, weeds moving in or nature seeding the void that Sarah talked about. You can do that all on your own, and that will be an out-of-pocket expense. Or with the program, you can get some boost payments from the program to help you establish that cover. So CRP pays generally 50% or more of the average cost to establish that type of cover that you choose to establish. However, there are additional incentive payments that depend on what kind of cover you're establishing, where you're located, and that can take the establishment cost coverage up to 100%. So, they're not willing to pay you more than 100% to establish the cover, but in some scenarios, you can get nearly all of your costs covered to establish the cover. Now, the thing that's really interesting and motivating for folks is the annual rental payment. So acres that are enrolled into the program earn an annual amount of money that's paid to the person who signs the contract to not farm those acres and to leave them in that permanent land cover. So that's how those acres will earn you money without farming them, is through that annual rental payment. Now, government programs aren't all puppy dogs and rainbows. Most people know that the government moves slow, there's hoops to jump through, and that's a reality. So I wanted to just touch on a couple things to make you aware of some important points. That way you can kind of anticipate the parts that maybe aren't as fun, but I also want to highlight the good stuff too. So let's start with the good stuff. So I mentioned at least 50% of the average cost to establish the permanent cover is paid to you, and you get an annual rental payment. So financial incentives are great. These contracts last from 10 to 15 years, depending on the cover type you're deciding to establish. So for a decade or more, you can count on receiving a payment that can be worked into your farm finances. So you can count on that money to come to you. And after your contract ends, oftentimes there's a good chance of re-enrollment into the program. So you can kind of roll those acres back over into the program as long as they're still in good shape and still accomplishing the goals of the program. So if you like it, you can go even beyond 15 years if that's available to you. CRP acres are still considered cropland. So for those of you guys who take advantage of the CAUV tax break program through your county auditor, CRP acres will still be considered cropland for your CAUV tax break. The programs are meant to work together, so it's not something that you have to worry about. Hedgerows. So Sarah mentioned that often there can be an issue with compaction in the hedgerows because of the need to turn around equipment. And the cool thing is about a lot of the CRP land cover types, you're actually permitted to turn your equipment around in the CRP acres. Now you can't store equipment there, and you can't use it as a farm lane where you're regularly driving up and down the acres. It still needs to be protected cover, but you can turn your equipment around in it. So instead of moving the compaction back into the field because you're avoiding the CRP acres, you can avoid the compaction issues on the interior of the field by turning around in the CRP. CRP kind of can open some doors to additional financial incentives. So kind of starting the conversation about CRP with your local office can kind of get the ball rolling for you to take advantage of all sorts of stuff that's available for you out there. And I'm going to highlight a couple of examples in the following slides of kind of what I'm talking about there. Planting assistance. So if pollinator habitat or warm season grasses sound cool to you, but you're like, yeah, I don't really know how to establish those or what time they need to be planted or where to purchase the seed. Well, lucky for you, by participating in the program, you'll be automatically connected with a conservation planner or biologist who will either know the answer to your question off the top of their head or will be willing to go and look up the answer to your questions. So you're connected with someone who can do the footwork for you as far as planning for putting in these permanent covers. Now, the cons to be aware of, potential cons, are that a maintenance activity will be required halfway through your contract. So for most people, that's in year 5 to 7. And that activity must be done, and it has to be done out of pocket. So there is not a cost share for the maintenance activity. So this could be something like interseeding, additional plant seeds to increase diversity. It could be planting wildflower plugs. It could be, all sorts of different stuff that's going to ensure that that permanent cover is meeting the goals of the program for the rest of your contract. But it's something to plan for because it will need to be done out of pocket. 10 to 15-year contract is also on the cons list. So if you offer up acres for enrollment into CRP and they are accepted into the program, you have the option to sign on the dotted line. Once you sign on the dotted line, you say that you're not going to farm those acres for 10 or 15 years. So if something crazy happens and you decide you need to farm those acres in year 3, you're going to be bringing on a world of hurt for yourself because you signed on the dotted line that you weren't going to farm those acres. So, you got to be sure that you're not going to want to farm those acres for the length of your contract to really kind of avoid a lot of trouble for yourself. If the haying or grazing was a side benefit that sounded interesting to you for establishing permanent cover, CRP is probably not the way to go because much like you're agreeing to not farm those CRP acres, you're agreeing to really not bother them at all for the life of the contract for the most part. So the program does not allow haying of the acres or grazing. And teamwork. So this is a nice way of saying that, again, you're going to have a contract. You're going to be held to what's in your contract and the standards of the program. So for example, for pollinator habitat, you need to have at least 9 species in the seed mix. So if you are bound and determined to only plant 3 species, you're not going to meet what's in the contract. So you have to work together with the program to meet a mutual goal of establishing permanent cover. And to do that, you have to be able to work within the bounds of the program and what's in your contract. So if you're somebody who just likes to get stuff done on your timeline, get the seed mix you want to get, I totally get it, and that's fine, but this program might not be something that you want to, do this work through. Okay, so I mentioned the additional doors that CRP can open. So I just wanted to give you 2 examples of kind of what I'm talking about. So one is Lake Erie Crep, which is like a subset of CRP. So it's only available to people in certain counties and to acres that are established to certain types of land cover. So you see in that second bullet, it says grass filter strips, forested riparian buffer, hardwood tree plantings. So if you're willing to do one of those land cover types, you could potentially take advantage of Lake Erie Crep if you meet all the eligibility requirements. But by kind of doing this special subset of CRP, you can take advantage of higher annual rental payments. So it has all the, the cost share and all of that, but this particular subset of CRP has higher payments that would, bump those acres further up into the green. Another example is the H2 Ohio program. So information about this program is changing rapidly. But the one thing I wanted to highlight is that to previously take advantage of H2 Ohio for private landowners, you first had to be enrolled in Lake Erie CREP, which is a CRP program. And if you did, and you met the H2 Ohio eligibility requirements and land cover types and all of that stuff, then you could earn $2,000 an acre one-time bonus through this program. But you first had to be in the Lake Erie CREP program. So that's kind of what I mean by CRP opening doors, is sometimes you start with asking about one thing and you learn about all sorts of other opportunities. So be sure to ask your local conservationist or your local conservation office about what might be available for the land cover type that you're most interested in establishing. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it over to Kara to talk about if you are interested in CRP, what is the next step that you actually should be doing?
Great, thank you, Abby. So if you are interested in possibly applying for CRP, the first thing that you need to do is to call your farm service agency and set up an appointment with them. And then they are going to decide whether or not you're eligible for the program. They're going to look at your land and they're going to look at you as a producer or your LLC or whatever your entity may be, and they're going to determine whether or not you're eligible for the program. There are several different subsets of CRP. Like Abby mentioned, we do have the CREP in certain areas, but we also have different types of CRP. So if you're interested in grass waterways or cool season filter strips, then you would look into we call it continuous CRP. That is limited to water quality practices, but we have other pollinator practices as well. So if you're looking into habitat types and developing habitat or just retiring a whole field of cropland, we have other versions of CRP that you could look into as well, but FSA will explain all of that. CRP general is competitive and the national office decides who gets funded. Continuous, as long as you're eligible for CRP and the practice is eligible, then you're in. So that's not competitive at all. With CRP, the person who contracts the CRP will operate and maintain the practice. So if you're the operator and you're renting this field that you're interested in working in, then you need to work it out with FSA on how to establish yourself as the operator for 10 years with the owner's consent, essentially. CRP, you do have to have cropping history on your farm, which means that you have to have produced a commodity crop for 4 out of the 6 years that are spelled out in that farm bill. So you'll again talk to FSA about that. But it does remain cropland, even if you were to switch it into this cover. Once eligibility is established, then I or the NRCS person for your county will go out to your field, hopefully with you, to discuss what practice you want to put out there and what the needs and suitabilities of the practices are in that area. And then NRCS develops a conservation plan and finalizes the technical details so that FSA can create a contract. Next slide, please. So with CRP, the important slide is, how do I get paid? First, you're going to install the practice after you've signed the contract. Then you need to save all of your receipts. If you do any of the work yourself, like if you're going to be doing the seeding yourself or any of the other potential work, you need to write yourself a bill yourself for the labor, and bring all of your bills and your seed tags into Farm Service Agency. Farm Service Agency does all the paperwork. They send it to me or my counterpart at NRCS. We'll go out to the field. We'll look at your seed tags. We're going to determine germination rate, the seeding rate that you put on, whether there was, weed seed percentage in the seed mix, what the pure live seed was. We're going to make sure that the practice that you installed meets our standards and specifications. And then we're going to tell FSA, yes, it did. And they're going to release the payment to you. FSA handles all the money, NRCS handles all of the technical. So once certified, they will send you a check. And then after that, it is just maintenance. So NRCS will prescribe all their annual required maintenance depending on the practice of what you will need to do, and you'll know that ahead of time before you sign any contracts. In year 5, there will be a required contract maintenance activity, and that again will be probably spelled out with a default practice at the beginning, but then in year 5, NRCS will come out and check the practice to make sure it's functioning how it should be, and we will suggest whatever maintenance is appropriate and site specific at that point in time. In addition, you will get that annual payment that Abby discussed, and that is also spelled out at the beginning of your contract. It's based on the soil types, and that annual payment usually comes in October or November because that's the beginning of our fiscal year. It is a nominal fee, but it's intended to cover that lost income on that acreage. Next slide.
Okay, so the other program that you could potentially take advantage of is called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or most people just call it EQIP because we love our acronyms. So this program is probably not as good of a fit to farm ground as CRP is, but it is a good option if anything about CRP scares you and you want to still take advantage of a program to help get some help establishing permanent cover. So this program is available throughout Ohio, regardless of what county you're in. You can take advantage of this program. And what's great about it is there's no cropping history requirement like there is for CRP. So if for some reason, the land that you want to establish permanent cover on wasn't cropped in the years that are spelled out in the Farm Bill, or maybe you broke ground recently and kind of want to revert those acres for some reason, you can still use EQIP. EQIP is cool too. It's a very flexible program, and so it can be used even beyond working to establish permanent cover. So Sarah gave you some examples of reasons why maybe acres aren't as productive. So maybe you're having, fast erosion of topsoil, so you don't have as much organic matter, or maybe you're having compaction issues in areas of the field. Well, EQIP can actually be used to address those issues as well, in ways that don't involve establishing permanent cover. So one easy example is EQIP can help establish cover crops, or the use of cover crops in your rotation. So even if the permanent cover thing doesn't really sound interesting to you, you might want to look into EQIP to see if there are ways to make improvements to your farm ground and to your soils that might help boost production for your acres. So the way that EQIP works is it remits a per practice payment. So instead of kind of giving a bulk amount of money towards establishing permanent cover, what happens is you or a vendor that might be doing the work for you goes out and, for example, sprays herbicide to get rid of any weeds that are growing in the area to be planted. And so after confirming that you've done that work, you'll get a dollar amount that's attached to spraying herbicide. And then maybe you disc to prepare the seed bed. So you get the dollar amount that's associated with disking. And then you seed it. So you get the dollar amount associated with seeding that type of cover. So it's kind of attached to each bit of work that you're doing. The program considers the different costs of applying the practice. So, applying or seeding an area isn't just paying for seed, it's paying for seed and the labor and the, farm equipment that's needed, and et cetera. So that per practice payment takes into account the different bylines that it takes to complete that practice. And interesting for this conversation is that some practices do take into account foregone income. So if you are using the program to establish permanent cover on currently farmed acres, you can potentially get a boost in the amount of money, the dollar amount that's assigned to that practice. And that's usually the practices that are used to establish permanent cover. So the conservation cover practice or the wildlife habitat seeding practice have higher payments for being applied on farm ground than they do for something like a turf area or a forested area. So back to the pros and cons. So the pro of this program compared to CRP is that the contracts can be shorter. So if you don't want to be locked into a 15-year contract or a 10-year contract, you can, consider EQIP. These contracts can run anywhere from 1 to 10 years. They are active as long as you are doing those practices, as long as you are doing the work. And you're going to know how long your contract is when you sit down to sign the paperwork. If you have one field and you're going to seed all the areas all at the same time, your contract could be 1 year. If it's going to take you longer to get the work done, it can be expanded. So again, it's a really flexible program. There's no mid-contract management. So again, once you complete the work laid out in your contract, then you're done applying the work in your contract. So nobody's going to be, requesting that you do management activities at a certain age of the permanent cover. That's going to be up to you. And there are always people available to advise you on management of these covers, but it will not be required through EQIP. The program can be used for large acreage, small acreage, weird shaped acreage. If you have an island in the center of the field that is unproductive and you want to put permanent cover there, you can use EQIP for that. And much like CRP, you will receive planning assistance, and a conservation plan will be created for the purposes of your farm, and your contract that'll lay out when to apply the seed or, in what order to do the practices. Cons, there is no rental payment. So maybe you turn those unproductive acres green in the first couple years where maybe you get a boost in the foregone income category for certain practice types, but you're not going to have a continuous income coming in through this program for not farming the acres. CAUV eligibility can be an issue. Every county administers this program differently, the CAUV program. So if you want to take advantage of EQIP and you're going to use it to establish permanent cover and take acres out of production, I highly suggest you go and talk with your auditor about if they have a reduced tax break rate for conservation use, which some counties do, or if you're going to lose that tax break, or maybe they have another solution for you that I don't know about yet, which is totally possible. But it's not meant to work together with CAUV like CRP is. So it's generally no longer going to be considered farm ground for establishing permanent cover. If you use cover crops or some of those other solutions, you're still farming it. So it's still farm ground. And again, teamwork. So by signing on the dotted line, you're going to be expected to hold to the standards of the program. That's all going to be laid out on your contract. You're going to know what's coming for you. But you will kind of have to work within the bounds of the program. It's not as hard as it sounds. It's just so it doesn't work for some people. So it's just good to be aware of. Okay, and with that, if EQIP is an interesting program for you, Kara's going to come on and talk to you about next steps for getting involved.
Yes, so applying for EQIP, the first thing that you would need to do is contact your local NRCS office, which would be me if you're in Portage or Trumbull County, or you can contact me and I will refer you to the correct person in your county. Then you will need to complete the form CPA 1200, which is the actual form number. Again, it's the government, we like acronyms and form numbers and everything. You will still complete your eligibility paperwork with Farm Service Agency. And even if you're an existing customer, you want to touch base with them to make sure all of your eligibility is up to date. Then NRCS will conduct a field visit and discuss conservation planning with you. And at this visit, we will determine resource concerns that may be out on your field or your farm. We'll conduct a natural resources inventory. We'll document your goals and some of your decisions that are made. And one thing to keep in mind is if you want to treat just the problem area or the red acres, then CRP is a great option for you. If you want to think a little bit bigger, EQIP can help you assess the whole field, or we can even go bigger and assess the whole farm or the whole tract. So EQIP is kind of CRP, you think of it as a small little Band-Aid for a small little issue, and EQIP starts to expand out and get a little bit bigger. So once we make the decisions of what we're going to include in the application, the DC will discuss the different funding pools with you and the timeline for that fiscal year and the different fund pools you could be eligible for. And NRCS will do the planning and the resource assessment. It is a competitive program, so you will be ranked. Your application will be ranked with like applications. So if it's something that we would consider a cropland application, you would be competing with other folks who are applying for cropland type practices, so similar. So we're trying to compare apples to apples. The state office will fund each funding pool from the top highest score all the way down until we run out of money for that year. So usually not every application gets funded in the year. And if your application is funded, you'll be offered a contract, and we will include all of your obligations and all of the dollars that will be set aside for you in that contract before you sign. So we will go over everything with you before you're obligated. Up until the point that you sign that contract, you can cancel it anytime. There's no obligation whatsoever. So there's really no risk in applying for this program whatsoever. Once you sign the contract, however, you are agreeing to install the practices that are in the contract to our standards and specs on time, with at least one practice being completed in the first 12 months. And then we are agreeing to provide all the technical assistance that you need to do that, and then set aside that money as the incentive payment. Just a little quick note, even though our paperwork process is slow, it does take time to get that planning done and to make decisions and to go back and forth a little bit. So we tell you some things and you have time to think about it. So please don't wait till the last day to sign up, or please don't wait even for an announcement to sign up. You can apply for EQIP at any time throughout the year. So if you're interested in this program at all, please contact your person at NRCS so that we can start working with you during the growing season, and then we can put together a solid application for next winter, hopefully. Next slide, please, Abby. Once you're contracted, like I said, you've got the basic obligation of installing the practice to our standards and specs. If engineering is involved, we would design it for you in most cases. And then all you have to do once it's established and paid is to maintain the practice for their intended lifespan. All of the other provisions of the contract, again, will be spelled out in the appendix, and at the time of signing, we'll go over all of that with you. So you're going to install the practice. We inspect it to make sure that it meets our standards and specs. If it's a seeding practice, save your seed tags, because we need those to determine that the right rate was put on. We will certify the practice. We as an NRCS will certify the practice. You sign for the payment, and then we release the payment directly to you. It's direct deposit. And then at that point, you are responsible for paying any of the vendors or people that you hired to help you get it done. Okay. We also have another program called CSP. And again, we talked about CRP kind of treats the problem area or just the red acres. EQIP can think bigger to just a field, or we can even go bigger than that if necessary. But CSP looks at your whole operation. So if you're interested in a conservation plan for your whole operation, CSP is the program for you. It's a voluntary conservation program, and it encourages people to address their resource concern in a more comprehensive manner. So we can use some practices to address those red acres and try to turn those red acres green on your whole operation, along with some of the other practices that may be in there that might be of interest to you. It encourages land stewards to improve their conservation performance by installing and adopting additional activities on top of what you may have done for EQIP, and improving and maintaining those existing practices. And it is eligible, all ag land is eligible, and all non-industrial private forest land is eligible as well. But this program does enroll your entire operation rather than just those red acres. So if you're interested in more detail, we'll go into that if you call your NRCS office.
Okay, so the last program that I wanted to highlight very briefly is the Ohio Hunter Landowner Access Partnership Program. Again, it's a mouthful, so we're calling it OLAP. And I wanted to highlight this opportunity. It's a little different. It doesn't pay to establish permanent cover, but for people who do have permanent cover, or even just straight up ag lands, there is you can take advantage of this program. So the intent of the program is to allow hunters onto private land with the permission of the landowner who has enrolled acres into the program. They allow hunters at a very low density. They only allow one person per 50 acres. So your property, if you do decide to enroll in this program, is not going to be crawling with people. There's just going to be somebody sitting in the acres that you've enrolled to hunt. I think the reason why it fits well with the conversation today is that if you do decide to enroll in CRP or EQIP or another Farm Bill program, that those acres are actually preferred in the application process. So much like EQIP, that's a competitive application process where only the top batch is funded. But if you have Farm Bill acres enrolled, you get some bonus points that will make you more competitive for the program. For acres that are enrolled into OLAP, for permanent cover acres, it earns $30 an acre, and ag land earns $2 an acre. So there are a couple things that I think would be interesting to you guys to help recede some worries about the program. And so the first is that there are no restrictions on farming. So if you decide to enroll some of the acres in your farm, you can still go about your operation as usual. You don't have to wait to a certain time of the day or a certain time of the month to operate. You go about your business as you normally would. You will have information about when people are on your property. So hunters check in via an online system to the property. So, you're going to know when people are there if you want to know that information. And you get to set the access points and choose the acreage that would be enrolled. So you do not have to enroll the entire property. If you have a woodlot on the back of the property and only want people there, you can just enroll the woodlot. And you can set the access point as well. So if you don't want people coming down your drive, but you have a back farm gate that people can park at and walk in from there, you're going to tell the DNR that information. They're going to mark that access point on the map, and the hunters are going to know, okay, that's where I go into the property. There is no deer gun hunting allowed and no trapping allowed as well. If you're interested in this program, you can Google it, or you can scan the QR code there, and that will take you to the information page for the program. Okay, and lastly, we're going to watch this video. It is about, I'm only going to run it for 3 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions. So let's see if this is going to work for us.
Hi, I'm Garrett Nowak, Site Manager of Farm Science Unique.
Hey Abby, the sound isn't working on your video.
Okay. Let me see. I also pulled up the pulled it up online. So let's see if that'll work. And if not, you guys can check it out.
Abby,
On
I
your
think you
own
just
time.
need to have your speakers up.
Oh, okay. I'll just play it since I got it here.
Actually, Abby, when you click your options to share screen, there should be an option to share with sound. At least that's what came up for me. So maybe unshare
Okay.
again.
Okay, let's try it again then. If this attempt doesn't work, then we'll just point you in the right direction so you can watch it on your own. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. I think that might work.
Hi, I'm Garrett Nowak, Site Manager at Farm Science Review. Today we're planting field 8A into soybeans, and we've got a little bit of a different management practice going on here. We're going to have Nate Doritas, our farm manager, tell you more about it.
So what we've decided to do is to find a way to take the red acres and turn them green. So when we say turn red acres green, it can mean several things. We can quite literally mean turn the red acres green from a profitability side and put them into a program that will pay us a set amount of income per acre, like a CRP program. You don't bring every input and along with it every input cost into those areas, and you simply reduce the amount of cost that it takes you to get across those acres. For us, we take those acres and take them out of the corn or soybean planting over multiple years and take that 133 acre field and bring it down to now it's about 118 acre field with those acres that are not consistently producing a profit out of the standard crop production side. And that'll help us in a couple ways. The one that we like the most is that you have those acres that are consistently producing. It's a smaller amount of acres, which is gonna, at the end of the year, increase the total yield per acre that comes out of that field. So from a crop insurance side, that's a thing that can help you with your proven yields. When it came time to get these new management zones planted to the perennial conservation mixes that we have chosen, we came about it, what we thought was the easiest and simplest way to do that. So we talked about how we created the management zones, we placed them in the equipment, and what we did is we went out and planted soybeans in the spring of 2020. That soybean planter knew where the management zones, both polygons and the new field edge on the south side of the field, it knew where those were, so it just simply shut off its seed rows when it came to that, and it started seeding on the other side, which left us a bare soil blank. After the soybeans came up, they became very easy to visually see. We took a different tractor and small seeder out there. We drove to those various polygon areas in early June, and we did some light tillage and then some seeding of those areas by just driving back and forth, and we seeded them in a couple different directions. But we could clearly see those polygons as we saw them on a yield map or profit map, and now a new management map in the field where the soybeans were growing around them. Made it very easy to get seeded what we needed to. And today when you look at them, they have a very green cast. They continue to fill in. And when you look at it against a bare soil or terminated cover crop landscape, you can really start to see what those management zones now look like. Our other partners, in this management practice include those equipment and technology providers like.
Okay, so the rest of the video is really about the technology. And so if that interests you, you can find this video on YouTube. Just Google Red Acres Green Farm Science Review. We just want, we don't want to deter people by making them think that you have to have a bunch of fancy
Like John
equipment.
Deere and our
But I think that video is great at just kind of helping visualize what we mean when we say, planting permanent cover or turning red acres green. So with that, we are going to, there we go. So we're going to leave this slide up while we answer questions. We've got a lot of people on the call, so there's different reasons to contact different people. So if you're interested in this technology that can be used to identify red acres or yield maps, or more about that, evaluating cost benefits for your particular farm, you can contact Sarah. I'm a wildlife conservation planner, so if you have special interest in attracting certain types of wildlife to your farm, including pollinators or insect pest predators, I can talk to you more about that. Kara, again, she only covers Portage and Trumbull counties. They give her enough to make her busy, to stay busy. So if you are in another county, you're going to need to look up your county's NRCS service center, or you can contact me and I will connect you with the right, or give you the right contact information. But if you want to find your service center, you can Google your county's name and local service center NRCS, or scan the QR code that's there on the page. So with that, we're going to open up to questions. We will review the chat if you want to type in your question, or feel free to click on the microphone button to unmute yourself, and you can ask your questions verbally as well. So also, if you have any experience with anything like this, with establishing permanent cover or identifying acres that are unproductive, and you feel like that has been helpful for you, feel free to share your experience as well. I think we covered it all. All right, well, that is the end of the presentation. So if you don't have questions, feel free to sign off or
Abby,
take note
there
of our
is
contact.
a question in the chat.
Yes, okay. So Dr. Eichler asks, are any of the programs amenable to planting low density trees corridors as productive windbreaks or other agroforestry options? Great question. So what comes to mind for me, and I'll let Kara and Sarah add on for things that they know about, but I know that equip can be used to plant trees and shrubs. And so long as you're not degrading the quality of the trees and shrubs, you can harvest fruits and nuts from those. I know that you can also plant trees and shrubs through CRP, but I'm not sure about the harvesting of those commodities. Gail says, great job, very interesting. Thank you, Gail. And thank you to Portage and Geauga and Lake and Soil and Water. And I saw Mandy's on too from the Farm Bureau. So a huge thank you to everybody who advertised for us, and to Anthony especially, who's running the meeting tonight. Thank you for being the behind the scenes guy. I appreciate it. Dr. Eichler says, thank you. You're very welcome.